By mid-1943, the Solomon Islands had become a corridor contest. Whoever controlled the island chain could extend air cover, protect sea lanes, and set conditions for the broader Allied plan to isolate the major Japanese base complex at Rabaul. The campaign phase that framed the Battle of Blackett Strait was the New Georgia operation, launched after the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February 1943 and the subsequent Allied advance into the Central Solomons. The immediate operational focus centered on New Georgia and adjacent islands because of airfields. The Japanese had built and defended key positions such as the Munda airfield on New Georgia, using it to contest Allied air and naval movement in the region. Allied forces, operating under the South Pacific Command structure, aimed to seize Munda to extend fighter coverage and tighten pressure on Japanese shipping and reinforcement routes. The landing on Rendova, just west of New Georgia, began on the 30th of June, 1943, creating a forward base for artillery, aircraft support, and small craft operations. Munda itself would fall on August 5, 1943, but the weeks leading to that date were defined by nightly resupply and reinforcement runs and frequent small-scale naval clashes in confined waters. For Japan, the Central Solomons were part of a defensive belt designed to delay Allied movement and preserve operational depth around Rabaul. Daylight movement by larger warships and transports was increasingly risky under Allied air power based in the southern Solomons and growing numbers of aircraft operating from newly developed forward fields. This pushed Japanese commanders toward night operations. Destroyers became the principal means of moving troops, rations, ammunition, and medical supplies into contested zones and evacuating wounded or withdrawing units when positions became untenable. These missions were shaped by speed and timing. Destroyers could move quickly, reduce exposure to air attack by operating after dusk, and use familiar island passages to reach unloading points near garrisons on New Georgia and Kolombangara. The geography around Kolombangara made these patterns predictable in one sense and dangerous in another. Blackett Strait, between Kolombangara and Arundel Island, is a narrow passage that connects operational areas around Kula Gulf and the waters off New Georgia. Its proximity to Japanese staging points, particularly Vila and Kolombangara, made it useful for night movement, but its constrained sea room also created conditions for ambush. In 1943, the contest in such straits was not primarily a clash of battle lines. It was a recurring struggle over short windows of darkness, navigational choke points, and the ability to identify targets before being identified. This is where PT boats entered the center of the story. United States Navy patrol torpedo boats were deployed forward from bases such as Tulagi and, later, the Rendova area to interdict Japanese night traffic. Typical 80-foot PT boats carried 21-inch torpedoes and a mix of machine guns and light cannon intended for close-range engagements. Their effectiveness depended on surprise, accurate identification, and coordinated attacks in darkness, tasks complicated by sea state, rain squalls, navigation hazards, and the possibility of encountering Japanese destroyers whose speed, gunnery, and durability exceeded what small wooden-hulled craft could absorb. Japanese destroyers, in turn, were operating under their own constraints. They needed to accomplish transport missions while remaining prepared for encounters with Allied cruisers and destroyers in nearby waters, and they had to navigate mine threats, air reconnaissance queues, and the growing presence of radar on Allied platforms. The result was an environment where both sides valued detection and first fire. Radar, lookouts, and local knowledge mattered as much as weapon specifications, especially in waters where distances closed quickly and misidentification could be fatal. A civilian and local dimension ran alongside these military pressures. The Solomon Islands population lived amid air raids, naval bombardments, forced labor demands in Japanese-held areas, and the disruptions of Allied base construction, troop movements, and disease. Coastwatcher networks and local guides provided information that shaped Allied awareness of Japanese movement, while Japanese forces relied on their own reconnaissance and local control around garrison points. For many island communities, the strategic logic of airfields and sea passages translated into immediate realities. Requisitioned food, damaged villages, restricted movement, and the presence of armed patrols. The Battle of Blackett Strait emerged from this larger system, rather than from a single pre-planned fleet engagement. It was a product of the New Georgia timeline, the Japanese reliance on night destroyer runs from staging points like Vila, and the Allied decision to contest those runs with PT boat ambush tactics in narrow waters. In that setting, a brief encounter could carry disproportionate consequences. The loss of a small craft meant trained crews and scarce equipment gone. The loss or damage of a destroyer disrupted a logistics cycle that garrisons depended upon night by night. In late July 1943, U.S. naval authorities at the PT base on Rendova received and decoded intelligence indicating that a Japanese destroyer group was scheduled to run the night of the 1st of August to the 2nd of August through Blackett Strait to support the garrison at Vila Plantation on Columbangara. The resulting U.S. plan was an interception by Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2. Commander Thomas G. Warfield briefed the skippers of PT 109 and 14 other boats on a northward sortie through Ferguson Passage into Blackett Strait, with instructions designed for night contact and rapid torpedo attack. The force sailed from Rendova at about 1830 on the 1st of August and was organized into 4 divisions of roughly 4 boats each. PT 109 operated in the division that also included PT 162, PT 159, and PT 157. On the Japanese side, the night movement reflected the operating pattern used in the Central Solomons under increasing Allied air pressure. Destroyers could deliver personnel and cargo after dark, then clear the restricted waters before daylight. The intelligence estimate referenced 5 destroyers, while later accounts of the night action described 4 Japanese destroyers transiting the area and avoiding a U.S. destroyer screen that arrived after the Japanese timing window had already passed. The first contacts at sea did not develop into a single coordinated clash. Only a portion of the U.S. PT formation had radar, concentrated in the section leaders, while other boats relied on sight and sound in a cloudy, moonless night with intermittent fog. Orders emphasizing radio silence until confirmed sightings, combined with the division-based setup, meant that several PTS did not receive timely target information during the approach and initial firing sequence. When the Japanese destroyers appeared, PT boats fired on estimated bearings rather than close-range visual identification. In total, 15 PT boats carried about 60 torpedoes available, and 8 boats fired 30 torpedoes during the encounter. No confirmed torpedo hits were recorded on the destroyers during this opening phase of the action. By around 2 a.m. on 2nd August, as the main firing ebbed and boats were dispersing to avoid counter-detection, PT-109, PT-162, and PT-169 remained in the patrol area under previously transmitted orders. PT-109 reduced speed and idled on one engine to limit its wake, a common tactic intended to reduce the chance of being sighted while visibility remained low and the situation picture was incomplete. In this setting, the decisive moment came without a torpedo exchange. Shortly after 1:30 on August 2nd in 1943, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, returning north from Vila after unloading supplies and 902 soldiers, encountered PT-109 at close range in Blackett Strait. The destroyer struck PT-109 forward of the starboard torpedo tube area, cutting the boat and throwing much of the crew into the water. 2 crewmen, Harold Marney and Andrew Kirksey, disappeared at the moment of collision and were not recovered. The remainder regrouped on floating wreckage in the hours before daylight. Amagiri continued on her route after the impact, having suffered damage from the collision. For U.S. commanders in the Central Solomons, night fighting in the confined channels around New Georgia and Columbangara was tied to a larger operational sequence. Keep pressure on Japanese logistics while ground forces closed on key airfields and coastal positions. By the time PT units were operating from forward anchorages near Rendova, the intent was not to defeat Japanese naval power in a single engagement, but to reduce the reliability of night resupply, force Japanese destroyers to spend time and fuel on evasive routing, and create cumulative risk for any ship entering restricted waters after dark. PT boats were chosen for this role because they could be forward-based, close to the straits, accelerate quickly, and attack with 21-inch torpedoes in short windows. The planning logic assumed that even a single hit on a destroyer could have effects disproportionate to the tonnage involved. Fewer destroyers available for transport runs, reduced flexibility for covering forces, and delays that would cascade onto garrisons dependent on nightly deliveries. The PT force also offered a way to contest waters that were too risky for larger Allied surface ships to patrol continuously at night under shore-based threats and uncertain contact reports. On the Japanese side, the strategic purpose of destroyer transport missions in 1943 was to sustain an island defense system under growing Allied air superiority. With daylight movement increasingly hazardous, destroyers took on a logistics function they were not originally designed for, delivering troops, ammunition, rations, and specialist personnel, while also remaining ready for surface combat if Allied cruisers or destroyers appeared. The planning constraint was time. A run needed to reach unloading points, complete transfer by boat or by quick alongside methods, and clear the danger area before first light. This created predictable patterns of approach and departure that could be exploited, but also meant Japanese destroyers emphasized speed, strict navigation discipline, and readiness to use gunfire immediately if small craft were detected at close range. Both sides planned around imperfect information. Allied intelligence in the Solomons blended radio intercepts, coastwatcher reporting, aerial reconnaissance, and post-action assessments from previous night engagements. The output was often a forecast, a likely destroyer movement along a likely route within a narrow time band. That was sufficient to launch PT patrols, but not enough to guarantee coordinated contact because the final variables, visibility, exact course changes, and timing at unloading points, could shift within minutes. Japanese commanders, for their part, understood that Allied PT boats and aircraft would concentrate near choke points, but they rarely knew in advance where a specific ambush line would be set, especially on nights with low visibility. The tactical planning problem for PT operations was control. A typical boat carried a limited number of torpedoes and relied on close-range attacks, but coordination across multiple boats in darkness was difficult. In 1943, only some PTs had effective radar, and even when radar was present, interpreting contacts in cluttered island waters was not straightforward. Radio discipline, intended to prevent Japanese direction finding, reduced the flow of real-time updates once boats dispersed into patrol sectors. That created a recurring trade-off. Tighter communications improved coordination, but increased detection risk. Tighter silence reduced detection risk, but increased the chance that separate sections would engage without massing fire. Weapons performance also shaped planning assumptions. PT attacks depended on torpedoes launched from short ranges at targets moving fast, often on crossing courses. Any error in estimating speed, angle, or distance could turn a firing opportunity into a miss. The boats could also be forced to break off after revealing themselves with engine noise, wake, or muzzle flashes, because destroyer gunfire at close range could disable a PT quickly. Japanese destroyers, by contrast, planned to avoid being slowed or fixed in place. Their doctrine in these transport runs emphasized completing the mission and disengaging rather than lingering to hunt small craft, unless a clear opportunity presented itself. Propaganda and morale narratives existed on both sides, but served different immediate functions. Allied reporting emphasized disruption of Japanese movement and the expanding reach of forward patrols, reinforcing the idea that Japanese night advantages were being narrowed. Japanese communications emphasized the continuation of transport success under pressure, supporting garrison confidence and portraying the destroyer runs as proof that reinforcement could still arrive. For participants at sea, the practical reality was more constrained. Planning was built around short time windows, partial sensor coverage, and the expectation that the decisive moment might come as a brief contact at very close range rather than a prolonged engagement. This set of goals and constraints produced the operating conditions that made Blackett Strait a high-risk environment. The U.S. objective was interception and attrition of night transport. The Japanese objective was delivery and withdrawal on schedule. In a narrow channel, those aims collided in minutes, and planning margins were small enough that a single navigation decision, a missed contact report, or a late sighting could determine whether the night ended as an exchange of torpedoes, a fleeting shadow contact, or a collision at speed. The night action in Blackett Strait began as a dispersed interception rather than a single, centrally directed battle. After leaving the Rendova area before dusk on August 1st, 1943, U.S. patrol boats moved north through island passages and then separated into patrol sectors so that at least one section would be positioned to meet a likely Japanese transit line. The intended advantage was proximity. The boats could wait in the restricted waterway, then sprint to launch torpedoes once a target was detected. Contact development depended on detection first. In these waters, some PTS carried radar and others relied on lookouts, engine sound, and wake traces. Once a radar-equipped boat reported a track, the practical problem became timing and geometry. Destroyers could cross the strait quickly, and torpedo-firing solutions required estimates of course and speed that were hard to refine in darkness with shifting visibility and land clutter in the background. The first engagements unfolded in brief sequences. PT sections accelerated to attack speed, turned to establish firing angles, and launched torpedoes in the direction of the Japanese column. The attacks were not synchronized into a single massed salvo. Separate PT groups fired as they gained target bearings, often without full knowledge of what other boats had already launched. In a narrow strait, this created overlapping attack runs and sudden course changes as boats tried to avoid collision with one another while still bringing tubes to bear. The Japanese destroyers responded primarily by preserving movement. Their immediate tactical priority during transport runs was to clear the danger area after unloading and to avoid being fixed in place by small craft. They increased speed, adjusted course, and continued through the passage rather than stopping to search. When PT boats were sighted or suspected, destroyers used gunfire to disrupt attack runs and force the smaller craft to break contact. Even near misses could be decisive. Shell splashes close aboard a wooden-hulled boat could throw spray across the cockpit, obscure vision, and compel evasive maneuvers that ruined a torpedo approach. For the PT crews, the engagement environment was compressed and confusing. Torpedo launches produced visible wakes that could reveal a firing position. Muzzle flashes from boat weapons, and any use of flares or searchlights risked exposing the attacker to rapid return fire. Radio discipline, intended to reduce Japanese ability to locate the PT formation electronically, limited the flow of real-time updates once the first contacts occurred. In practice, many boats were operating on partial situational awareness, making decisions based on a single radar report, a sighting, or the sound of high-speed screws in the dark. The outcome of these first exchanges was uneven in immediate effect. U.S. boats expended a significant portion of their torpedoes during the encounter, but there were no confirmed torpedo hits on the destroyers during the opening phase. The Japanese ships, despite maneuvering and firing, maintained their transit and continued away from the strait on schedule. This did not mean the PT effort was irrelevant. It meant the engagement did not produce the specific result the PT attacks were designed to achieve that night, disabling a destroyer in the confined channel. As the destroyers cleared the immediate contact area and PT boats separated to avoid counterfire and regroup, the action shifted from a torpedo exchange to a different kind of risk, typical of night operations in narrow waters. Boats that remained on station at low speed to reduce visibility were still in a traffic corridor used by faster ships exiting the transport run. In that transition period, after the first attacks had ended, but before the night patrol had fully disengaged, the conditions were set for the most decisive event of the engagement, a high-speed, close-range encounter in low visibility that would not be settled by torpedoes at all. The collision in Blackett Strait created an immediate crisis measured in hours, not days. PT-109 had a crew of 13. 2 men were missing after the impact, leaving 11 survivors in the water amid floating wreckage, fuel sheen, and darkness. With no time to establish radio contact and no ability to maneuver, the survivors consolidated around the largest remaining section of the hull, using it as a flotation platform while trying to keep the group together as the current carried them. For the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, the practical decision at the moment of contact was to continue. In a night transport environment, stopping in a confined strait risked torpedo attack or gunfire from other small craft. The destroyer maintained its route away from the unloading area, carrying any collision damage forward into subsequent operations. From the perspective of the destroyer crew, the event was a brief, close-range encounter in low visibility that did not alter the larger mission. Clear the danger zone before daylight and rejoin the broader movement pattern. On the U.S. side, the escalation was logistical as well as human. PT operations were already a high-consumption cycle. Fuel, torpedoes, engine parts, and trained crews were limited, and boats were forward-based in exposed anchorages that depended on nightly movement of supplies. The loss of a single boat reduced patrol coverage in a choke point where coverage depended on numbers. Commanders also had to decide whether to risk additional boats in a search area where Japanese destroyers could still pass through before dawn, and where daylight air threat limited surface movement after first light. The survivors faced a sequence of decisions shaped by distance and physical condition. Remaining on the water through daylight increased the probability of being seen by aircraft or surface craft, but also increased dehydration and exposure. Swimming to land reduced visibility to passing ships, but required sustained effort while towing injured men. The group moved toward the nearest small islands and eventually reached shore, carrying a severely burned crewman and redistributing flotation to keep him above water. Once ashore, the crisis changed again, finding drinkable water, limiting movement to avoid detection, and deciding whether to signal for rescue in an area where both Japanese patrols and Allied aircraft operated. Civilian and local perspectives were central at this stage. The islands were not empty space. Solomon Islander scouts, guides, and coastwatcher networks had been operating throughout the campaign, gathering information on ship movements and assisting Allied personnel. For local communities, contact with armed forces involved risk. Japanese units had security patrols and coastal observation posts, while Allied forces also conducted searches and reconnaissance. Moving survivors across islands could expose helpers to detention or retaliation, and it required knowledge of beaches, reefs, and inland trails that outsiders typically lacked. As the days passed, the incident became a command problem as well as a survival problem. U.S. forces had to determine whether a boat had been lost by enemy fire, mechanical failure, or collision, and where to concentrate limited search assets. The search space was constrained by geography, but complicated by the number of possible drift and swim routes between small islands and by the fact that survivors, if alive, were likely avoiding open beaches during daylight. Each additional night without confirmation increased uncertainty, while Japanese destroyer runs and patrol activity continued. For Japanese commanders, the wider crisis context remained the same: sustain garrisons under pressure and keep the transport cycle running. For Allied commanders, the context combined two timelines: a tactical timeline measured in minutes during the engagement, and a humanitarian and operational timeline measured in days as they tried to recover missing personnel without weakening the night interdiction effort. In Blackett Strait, escalation did not mean a larger surface battle on the same night. It meant a prolonged contest between limited resources, persistent enemy movement, and the reality that a single brief contact could generate consequences that outlasted the engagement itself. The most intense phase unfolded between dawn on August 2nd and the morning of August 8, 1943, when survival decisions, local reconnaissance, and Allied recovery planning converged in a space of a few miles of reef-bound islands. After the collision, the remaining hulk of PT-109 stayed afloat briefly but took on water and capsized later on August 2nd. With 11 survivors and no radio, the crew chose movement over waiting. The nearest land was a small islet roughly 3.5 miles away. The group swam in stages, using a plank as a tow platform for men who could not sustain the distance unaided, and for the most seriously injured crewman, Patrick McMahon, who had suffered severe burns. The decision traded immediate exposure at sea for concealment on land in an area where Japanese traffic and patrols were plausible. The islet they reached was known locally as Plum Pudding Island, later widely associated with the PT-10-9 story. It offered limited cover and no secure supply of food or water. The crew rationed energy and reduced movement during daylight to limit detection. At night, the situation shifted. The same darkness that hid them also made rescue uncertain. Kennedy attempted to make contact by swimming toward Ferguson Passage, a route used by Allied PT boats when operating in and around Blackett Strait. He spent extended periods in the water, listening and watching for engines and silhouettes, then returned against strong currents that could pull a swimmer back into the strait. The broader campaign did not pause for the disappearance of one boat. In early August 1943, the Central Solomons remained contested by air, surface, and small craft forces. Japanese destroyer runs continued to move troops and supplies into the Kolombangara area at night, while Allied units focused on consolidating positions taken in the New Georgia operation and sustaining forward bases. This meant that every movement by the survivors and every recovery attempt by Allied forces had to be planned under the assumption that Japanese vessels might pass nearby in darkness, and that daylight exposure could bring air threat. On August 4th, the survivors shifted again, swimming to Olasana Island in search of food and water, and to improve their position relative to Ferguson Passage. Coconuts provided limited calories, but fresh water was not reliably available, and the group remained constrained by injury, fatigue, and the need to avoid open beaches for long periods. The next move, on August 5th, was to Nauru Island, whose eastern shore faced Ferguson Passage more directly. Kennedy and George Ross located supplies left from previous activity in the area, including a small canoe and containers of food and water, which altered the survival calculus. It became possible to move a message rather than only wait and watch. The critical link came through Solomon Islander scouts working for the Allied Coast Watcher Network. Byukugasa and Aroni Kumana encountered evidence of the stranded crew and established contact. Communication was limited by language and the risks of visible signaling. A written message became the simplest reliable method. With no paper available, Kennedy carved the essential details into a green coconut husk: location, survivors, and the need for a small boat. The scouts carried this message onward to the Coast Watcher post, led by Lieutenant A. Reginald Evans, who coordinated with Allied naval authorities. From the Japanese perspective, the same geography that enabled an ambush also enabled concealment and movement by local canoes. Patrol routines and observation posts in the island chain were intended to detect Allied activity, but the environment imposed limits: thick vegetation, reefs that constrain landing sites, and the challenge of distinguishing local movement from military movement at a distance. For the scouts, operating in waters and villages under wartime pressure, assisting stranded Allied personnel carried practical personal risk. On August 7th, the recovery effort entered its most delicate phase. Islander paddlers moved Kennedy to a rendezvous near Gomu Island in Blackett Strait to coordinate directly with Evans. The base commander proposed retrieving the survivors immediately, but Kennedy argued that he should guide the rescue boats through reefs and shallows. Late on August 7th, PT-157 and PT-171 approached the rendezvous under a prearranged signal. Kennedy, short on ammunition, improvised the full signal using a borrowed rifle for the fourth shot. The boats then crossed back through the strait under his direction and reached Olasana early on August 8th, recovering all 11 survivors. By about 5:30 that morning, the group was back at the U.S. base on Rendova. In military terms, the peak was not a larger surface battle, but a concentrated test of operational continuity. Japanese night movement continued. Allied interdiction remained active, and a small recovery mission had to be executed inside the same contested maritime space. In human terms, it was the moment when the constraints of injury, distance, and concealment intersected with local knowledge and a narrow window of naval access, producing an outcome determined as much by geography and communication as by weapons. After the night of 1st to 2nd August 1943, both sides treated Blackett Strait less as an isolated incident and more as evidence of how quickly the night sea fight in the Central Solomons was changing. The environment imposed repeated problems: detection, identification, and timing, and each participant adapted within their material limits. For U.S. PT forces, the immediate lesson was coordination. The interception had involved multiple divisions operating in low visibility, with uneven distribution of radar and strict radio discipline. Post-action practices increasingly emphasized placing radar-equipped boats where they could act as contact setters, then concentrating other boats for a single-timed attack rather than scattered launches. In practical terms, this meant refining patrol lines, tightening procedures for when radio silence could be broken, and standardizing simple, pre-briefed signals to reduce confusion once contact occurred. Weapons and maintenance constraints also drove adaptation. PT boats carried a small torpedo load, and each night, patrol consumed fuel and stressed engines. Operating from forward bases such as Rendova compressed the repair cycle and increased the value of predictable, repeatable tactics that did not depend on prolonged, high-speed maneuvering. Crews adjusted by favoring short sprint approaches from concealment positions, limiting gunfire that revealed their location, and withdrawing quickly after launches to avoid destroyer gunnery. The objective remained the same: disrupt Japanese night transport, but the method increasingly relied on minimizing exposure time inside the destroyer's effective engagement envelope. Japanese destroyer crews adapted in parallel. Transport runs required them to pass through the same choke points repeatedly, which created an incentive to vary route and timing within the constraints of darkness and navigation hazards. Lookout practices, illumination discipline, and immediate gunnery response against suspected small craft became central. Destroyers could not routinely pause to conduct searches in restricted waters without increasing vulnerability to torpedoes, so they emphasized speed, tight station keeping, and rapid course changes when wakes or engine noise suggested nearby PTS. The collision with PT-109 reinforced a narrow water reality. Even without torpedo hits, close-range encounters could impose damage and operational friction, so bridge teams had to balance aggressive transit with caution around likely ambush lanes. Adaptation extended beyond the boats at sea. On the Allied side, Coastwatcher networks and local scouts were integrated into recovery and reconnaissance tasks in ways that did not require large movements of ships. The rescue of the PT-109 survivors demonstrated that information transfer could be achieved through low-signature methods, canoes, written messages, and indirect routes between islands when radio contact was not possible. For local Solomon Islander participants, this work required navigating patrol risk and choosing when movement would be less visible. Their role in communications and movement was an operational resource shaped by geography and social ties, as much as by formal command relationships. Japanese forces also relied on land-sea integration. Garrison points on Kolombangara and nearby islands maintained coastal observation and security patrols intended to detect small craft activity and discourage cooperation with Allied networks. In areas within Japanese control, civilians faced restrictions and coercion. In contested areas, communities managed movement and supplies under uncertainty about which force might appear next. The civilian experience of adaptation was therefore practical, shifting garden work, travel, and shelter use to reduce exposure to raids, bombardment, or forced labor demands, while also responding to the arrival of wounded men, intelligence collectors, or stranded sailors. Psychological strain was another dimension of adaptation. For PT crews, repeated night sorties combined high workload with uncertain contact and the possibility that a single brief encounter could end with gunfire, collision, or grounding on reefs. For destroyer crews, the transport mission added fatigue, high-speed navigation at night, unloading under threat, and immediate withdrawal, repeated over many nights. Both sides adjusted by narrowing tasks and emphasizing routines, checklists for engines and weapons, set reporting formats, and strict watch rotations, because consistent procedure reduced the chance that a single error in darkness would cascade. By early August 1943, the campaign around New Georgia and Kolombangara was producing a pattern. Japanese transport runs remained possible, but each run carried cumulative risk. Allied interdiction efforts remained active, but success depended on detection, concentration, and reliable torpedo employment. Blackett Strait functioned as a laboratory of that adaptation cycle. the participants resisted not only each other, but also the limits imposed by geography, night visibility, and logistics, adjusting their methods to keep operating inside a narrow margin where minutes and small decisions mattered. In the first week of August 1943, the operational balance around New Georgia and Kolombangara began to shift in ways that narrowed Japanese options and widened Allied freedom of action. Two developments framed that shift: the fall of Munda Airfield on August 5th, and a rapid change in the results of night surface actions in the waters northwest of New Georgia. Munda mattered because it reduced distance for Allied fighters and strike aircraft to key sea routes and to Japanese staging points on Kolombangara. The immediate effect was not the end of Japanese night transport, but a tightening of the daylight constraint. Destroyers still moved after dark, yet their ability to loiter, conduct repeated unloading cycles, or accept delays decreased because any late departure increased exposure after dawn. As Allied aviation strength expanded and airfields moved forward, the time margin that had made destroyer transport viable became smaller. The Battle of Blackett Strait on the 1st to 2nd of August had shown how difficult it was for PT boats to translate contact into verified torpedo hits in a narrow channel with uneven radar coverage and limited coordination. The collision that destroyed PT-109 was tactically decisive for those involved, but it did not stop the transport run that night. From the Japanese viewpoint, the destroyer mission had still achieved its immediate logistic purpose, and the ability to move supplies and troops by night remained a central assumption of the defense. The turning point came days later, when the character of night fighting changed from dispersed small craft ambushes to radar-directed destroyer attacks with coordinated torpedo tactics. On the night of August 6th to 7th, 1943, in the Battle of Vella Gulf, a U.S. destroyer force intercepted a Japanese destroyer group conducting a troop transport mission. Using radar contact to control approach and torpedo firing, the U.S. ship sank 3 Japanese destroyers, Kawakaze, Arashi, and Hagakaze, while the surviving Japanese destroyers withdrew. U.S. forces reported no ships lost in the engagement. The outcome indicated that Japanese transport runs now faced the risk of concentrated destroyer interception, not only harassment by PTs. For Japanese commanders, this forced a reassessment. Destroyers were both transport tools and key fleet assets, and the loss of multiple ships in a single night cut into the capacity to sustain garrisons and to contest Allied surface forces. The transport requirement did not disappear, but choices narrowed: fewer runs, heavier reliance on barges, and smaller craft in protected coastal waters, greater dispersion of unloading points, and a growing emphasis on evacuation planning where positions could not be held. For U.S. commanders, the same sequence validated a shift in method. Rather than depending primarily on PT attacks and choke points, the developing approach combined forward airfields, patrol craft, and radar-equipped destroyers to contest the entire movement system. Detect the run, intercept it before unloading, and impose losses that could not be replaced quickly. PT boats remained useful for screening, harassment, and short-range strikes. But the decisive interdiction capability increasingly rested with coordinated surface units using radar to control the engagement. The civilian and local dimension also changed as momentum shifted. As Japanese supply reliability declined and Allied presence expanded, local communities experienced a change in the pattern of contact. More Allied patrols and construction activity near newly secured positions, and more Japanese movement by small craft and foot along shorelines, as larger ship transport became riskier. For islanders working with coast watchers or acting as guides, the balance of danger remained, but the sources of danger diversified. Airstrikes, coastal patrols, and intensified reconnaissance on both sides as each tried to map and control the same narrow sea passages. In this sense, Blackett Strait sits at a hinge point. It demonstrated both the reach and the limits of PT interdiction in early August 1943, and it occurred just before a sequence of events that reduced Japanese confidence that destroyer transport could continue at an acceptable cost. The turning point was not a single moment inside the strait, but the convergence of forward air power and radar-directed surface interception that altered the risk equation for every night run that followed. Combat in Blackett Strait ended within minutes on the night of the 1st of August 1943, but the immediate aftermath extended across the following week and then fed into the wider Central Solomons campaign. For the USPT force, the most direct operational result was the loss of PT-109 and 2 crewmen. 11 survivors were recovered at dawn on August 8th and returned to the Rendova base. Their first hours back were shaped by medical triage, debriefing, and the practical need to reconstruct events in a setting where multiple PT divisions had fired torpedoes without confirmed hits, and where the decisive loss had come from a collision rather than enemy gunfire or torpedo impact. The squadron resumed night patrols because the larger mission, interdicting Japanese movement between staging points on Kolombangara and contested areas around New Georgia, continued without pause. Recovery itself became part of the operational picture. Search procedures and rescue planning had to account for currents, reefs, and the likelihood that survivors would move between islands to find water. The role of Solomon Islander scouts and Coast Watcher coordination demonstrated a low-signature method for moving information in a contested zone, and Allied commanders integrated such channels where possible because they reduced the need to expose larger craft in daylight. For Japan, the immediate outcome of the night was that the destroyer transport pattern remained viable in the short term. The destroyer that collided with PT-109 continued its movement away from the unloading area, consistent with the priority to clear restricted waters before daylight. In logistical terms, that night's run still represented the core purpose of these missions, delivering personnel and supplies to sustain garrisons under pressure. In tactical terms, the encounter reinforced that choke points carried multiple risks, including the possibility of close-range contact with small craft that might not be detected in time to avoid collision. The broader campaign context moved quickly after the incident. Ground fighting on New Georgia continued toward its conclusion, and Allied air and surface forces expanded their reach as forward positions solidified. Japanese commanders faced a narrowing set of options: continue reinforcing threatened garrisons by destroyer runs, shift more burden to barges and smaller craft along coastal routes, or plan phased withdrawals from positions that could no longer be sustained at acceptable cost. Allied commanders, observing Japanese movement patterns, increasingly emphasized radar-directed surface interception and the selective bypassing of heavily defended islands in favor of isolating them. Civilians and local communities experienced the aftermath less as a discrete battle and more as an extension of wartime pressure. The islands used for concealment and movement were also places where people lived, fished, and traveled. The movement of survivors, the actions of scouts, and subsequent patrol activity created short-term risks of detection and retaliation in contested spaces, while the continuing campaign brought ongoing displacement, requisitioning, and restrictions tied to whichever force temporarily controlled nearby shorelines. By mid-August 1943, the incident had been absorbed into routine. USPT patrols continued to probe the straits. Japanese night movements continued where feasible, and both sides adjusted their procedures based on contact reports and losses elsewhere. In that sense, the withdrawal was not a formal retreat from Blackett Strait, but a return to the larger system of night operations in the Central Solomons, one in which a single brief encounter could generate consequences lasting days for individuals and weeks for planning staffs. In strict operational terms, the Battle of Blackett Strait on the 1st to 2nd of August 1943 did not alter control of the Central Solomons by itself. Japanese destroyers completed that night's transport task at Vila, and USPT forces did not record confirmed torpedo hits in the engagement. The material outcome was specific. PT-109, one of the boats committed to the interception, was lost after a close-range collision with 13 crewmen aboard, 2 missing and presumed killed, and 11 rescued 6 days later. Its longer-term significance lies in what it illustrates about the Solomons Night War in 1943. First, it shows the limits of small craft interdiction when coordination is constrained by low visibility. uneven radar coverage, and radio silence. PT boats could be positioned inside choke points such as Blackett Strait, but converting detection into verified results required timing and concentration that were difficult to achieve consistently. Second, it highlights how Japanese destroyer transport missions operated under a narrowing schedule enforced by Allied air power. Success depended less on defeating attackers and more on completing unloading and clearing restricted waters before daylight. In such conditions, risk included not only torpedoes and gunfire, but also navigation hazards and close contact events at speed. The episode also became a reference point for the human dimensions of maritime warfare. The survival period from 2 to 8 August demonstrates how outcomes could depend on geography and local knowledge after combat ended. The rescue depended on movement between small islands, concealment during daylight, and communication by improvised means when radios were unavailable. Solomon Islander scouts Bayuku Gasa and Ironi Kumana, working within the Allied Coast Watcher system, carried a message that enabled recovery. Their role underscores that the campaign was not fought only by ship crews and infantry units. It also relied on local networks that shaped information flow and physical movement in contested terrain. In public memory, Blackett Strait became best known through the later biography of PT-10-9's commanding officer, John F. Kennedy, and through post-war media. The incident was described in popular accounts and portrayed in the 1963 film PT-109, which fixed a specific narrative focus on survival and rescue. That attention did not always translate into equal visibility for other participants, including the remaining crewmen and the local scouts who carried the message and guided contact with the Coast Watchers. Over time, commemorations in the Solomon Islands and later public recognition of local participants became part of how the story was retold, adding a corrective layer that emphasizes the shared, multi-actor nature of the outcome. For Japanese naval history, the event is mainly a small episode within a larger logistical struggle, destroyers being used as transport under increasing Allied air pressure and under growing risk from radar-equipped Allied surface forces. From this perspective, the collision is less a defining tactical action than an example of how repeated night transits through constrained waters accumulated hazards and could impose friction even when the transport mission itself was completed. Historically, the battle's legacy is therefore uneven across scales. At the campaign scale, it is a minor engagement within the New Georgia and Kolombangara sequence, soon overshadowed by larger radar-directed surface actions, and by the Allied advance that followed the capture of forward airfields. At the individual and cultural scale, it became a widely circulated case study of crew survival, small unit decision-making, and the importance of local reconnaissance and communication. The result is a dual significance: limited strategic consequence in 1943, and lasting influence on how the Solomons campaign has been remembered, narrated, and debated in the decades since.